People always ask me what the worst part of that night was. The cold. No. The waiting. No. The worst part was knowing that half the men around me wanted her to fail. Let me back up. My name doesn't matter much for this. I was a young guy then. 24, maybe 25. I'd been with the unit about 8 months, which in that world means you know just enough to be dangerous to yourself. We were stationed out of a forward base that wasn't on any map you could buy. A cluster of tents and shipping containers stacked in a valley where the wind came down off the ridges every evening like it had somewhere better to be. And the woman in charge of our sniper element was named Adrian Kovac. Lieutenant Commander. We called her Kovac or Ma'am depending on the mood. Behind her back, some of the guys called her other things. I'm not proud to say I laughed at some of those jokes. I want that on the record. I was young and stupid and I went along with the room because that's what young and stupid does. She was maybe 5'6", lean but not in a fragile way, the kind of lean that's all wire and quiet. She kept her hair short, scraped back, and she had this way of looking at you where she'd let a question hang in the air for a full second longer than felt comfortable before she answered. People mistook that pause for slowness. It wasn't slowness. I figured that out eventually. It was her deciding whether you were worth the words. When she first showed up to take over the element, there was a guy named Briggs. Big guy. Loud. The type who measured everybody by how much they could bench and how many stories they could tell about places they'd been. Briggs took one look at her on that first day, and you could see something close down behind his eyes, like he'd already finished the math and decided the answer. "They're sending us a school teacher," he said in the chow tent that night, not even quietly. He wanted her to hear it. She heard it. I watched her hear it. She was 3 tables away, eating cold beans out of a pouch, and she didn't flinch, didn't turn, didn't give him a thing. She just kept eating, and that bothered Briggs more than if she'd thrown the pouch at his head. I think that was the first crack in my own dumb opinion of her, because I'd expected her to react. Everybody who's insecure reacts, and she just didn't. Still, I want you to understand the climate of the place. This was a unit that had been together a long time. They'd lost guys. They'd carried each other off mountains. And here comes this small, quiet woman to lead the most precise, most unforgiving job on the team, and the bond they had didn't have a door she could walk through. Not yet. The mocking wasn't always loud. That's the thing people get wrong when I tell this. They picture guys openly sneering. Mostly it was small. It was the way questions got asked twice when she gave an order, like the first answer hadn't quite landed. It was the way a couple of the senior guys would glance at each other when she spoke, a flicker, gone before you could name it. It was the way her call sign got said with just a half degree of extra weight. She knew, of course she knew. You don't get to where she got by being blind to a room. There's a thing she did that I only understood much later. Every evening, after the light went flat and orange over the ridgeline, she'd go out past the last container with her rifle and a spotting scope, and she'd just read the valley. For an hour. Sometimes 2. She'd lie there in the dirt and the cold, and she'd watch the way the air moved over the rocks, the way the heat came up off the road in the afternoons and died at dusk, the way a flag 2 kilometers out would lift and fall. Briggs called it showing off. "Look at her," he said one evening, "out there posing for nobody." But she wasn't posing. I know that now. She was building a map in her head that none of the rest of us had. She was learning that valley the way you learn a person's face. The wind at the 800-meter mark behaved differently than the wind at the 1,200. There was a thermal that came off a flat rock near the dry creek every afternoon and lied to your bullet by a couple of inches if you didn't know it was there. She knew it was there. We didn't. We thought we were the gunslingers and she was the paperwork. Okay, the night. It started the way these things always start, which is to say it started with a phone ringing in a tent and everybody's stomach dropping at the same time. There was a compound about 11 kilometers out. Mud walls, a couple of low buildings, a central courtyard. For weeks it had been nothing on our radar, a nothing place. But that night the word came down fast and ugly. A group of aid workers, 4 of them, 2 nurses, a logistics guy and a translator, had been grabbed off a road that afternoon and were being held inside. The people holding them weren't soldiers in any sense that means discipline. They were worse than soldiers in some ways. Unpredictable. Twitchy. The kind of group where one nervous finger turns a standoff into a massacre. And the intelligence said there were a dozen of them inside, maybe more, and they'd already executed one of the local drivers to prove they were serious. The clock was the enemy. That's what the captain kept saying. The clock. Negotiation wasn't on the table the way you'd hope. Every hour those 4 people sat in that courtyard was an hour closer to them not coming out. So a plan came together the way plans come together at 3 in the morning, which is to say frantically, and with a lot of men talking over each other. The assault element would go in close, breach the wall, clear the buildings, get the hostages. Standard, brutal, fast. But there was a problem, and everybody in the tent could see it on the map. The courtyard. To get the hostages out, the assault team had to cross open ground in the center of that compound, and the rooftops around the courtyard gave the hostiles a clean view of every step of that crossing. If even a couple of them got up onto those roofs with rifles when the breach went loud, our guys would be crossing 40 meters of open dirt into a shooting gallery, and the hostages would be right there in the middle of it. The whole thing hinged on Overwatch. Somebody, one shooter, maybe a spotter, had to be out on the high ground to the east, far back in the dark, and that shooter had to own those rooftops. The second the breach went loud and the hostiles rushed up to defend, that shooter had to take them off the roofs before they could fire down into the courtyard. Fast. Clean. No misses. Because a miss didn't just mean a missed shot. A miss meant a round going long into a building full of hostages and friendlies. It was an 1,100-meter problem, in the dark, with wind, with heat shimmer dying off as the night cooled, with targets that would appear for 2, maybe 3 seconds before they could do their damage. And it had to be one person, because the high ground that gave the angle was a single narrow shelf of rock, and you couldn't fit a team up there without lighting it up like a campfire. The captain looked around the tent. And here's the thing nobody likes to admit. There was a pause, a real one, because everybody knew who the best long-distance shooter in that valley was. Everybody had seen the range data. We all knew. And nobody wanted to say it because saying it meant admitting the schoolteacher was the only one who could carry the whole night on her back. Kavek said it for them. "It's mine," she said, just that. Quiet, like she was confirming a grocery order. Briggs actually laughed. I'm not exaggerating. A short, ugly bark of a laugh, the kind that's half nerves and half meanness. 1,100 at night with their lives on it. He shook his head. "Ma'am, with respect, and there was no respect in it, none. That's not a place to be proving a point." The tent went very still. And Kavek turned and looked at Briggs with that long pause of hers. 1 second, 2. "I'm not proving anything," she said. "I've shot that wind every evening for 3 weeks. I know what the round does at 1,140 when the temperature drops 2 degrees. Do you?" Briggs didn't have an answer, because of course he didn't. He'd been calling it posing. She picked up her rifle. "We moved out a little after 3. I was on the assault element, not with her, so most of what I'm telling you about the shelf I pieced together later, from her spotter, from the radio traffic that's burned into my memory, from things she said once, years on, when she finally talked about it. She took one man with her, a quiet kid named Toller who carried her spotting gear and did exactly what she told him and nothing else. They peeled off from the rest of us a few kilometers out and started the climb up to that narrow shelf of rock on the eastern ridge, while the rest of us pushed toward the compound on foot. I remember the walk in. The cold gets into a strange place in your chest before something like that. Not fear exactly. More like your body knows something your brain is still pretending isn't true. Nobody talked. You could hear gear shifting, breath, the crunch of boots trying to be quiet on loose stone. Up on the shelf, Kavek was building her position. Toller told me about it later, and the way he described it stuck with me. He said she didn't rush. That's the part that astonished him. The whole world was a clock running down, and she lay down behind that rifle slow and deliberate, like she had all the time God ever made. She built up the dirt under the bipod. She got the rifle settled. She checked the wind again, the same wind she'd read for 3 weeks, and she dialed her scope, and then she went quiet and just breathed. She got slower the closer we got, Toller said. Everybody else gets faster. She got slower. That's a sniper. That's the whole thing right there if you ever want to understand it. The world speeds up and they slow down. She had eyes on the compound now. The courtyard. The 4 rooftops that mattered, low mud brick roofs maybe 4 meters up, with little parapets a shooter could lie behind. She lay there in the dark and she watched those empty rooftops, and she waited for them to stop being empty. On our side, we stacked on the outer wall. I could feel the guy in front of me breathing. The breacher set the charge. The captain's voice came low in my ear, counting it down, and my whole body turned into one held breath. And the wall went. I will never forget that sound as long as I live. The crack of it, and then the world tearing open into noise and dust and movement. We poured through. And here's what happened in the next 5 minutes. And I want to tell it the way it actually happened, not the clean way. Because the clean way is a lie. It wasn't clean. It was the most violent, compressed, terrifying 5 minutes of my life, and the only reason any of us are still here to argue about it is what one small, quiet woman did on a rock 1,100 meters away. The second the breach went loud, the compound came awake like a kicked hornet's nest. Shouting, confusion, and then, exactly what the captain had been afraid of, the hostiles started scrambling for the high ground. They knew. They knew the courtyard was the killing floor, and they wanted the roofs. The first one came up onto the eastern rooftop with a rifle, looking down into the courtyard where, in about 10 seconds, our assault team was going to be crossing with 4 terrified hostages. He never got to look for long. Toller said she didn't even seem to react to him appearing. No jolt, no scramble. She'd been waiting on that exact patch of roofline for an hour, and when the shape rose up into it, she just finished the breath she was already taking, and the rifle spoke. At 1,100 meters, the bullet takes more than a second and a half to get there. Think about that. She had to put a round into a space where a man would be a second and a half in the future. And she did. He went down before the sound of the shot even reached him. 1, she said on the radio, flat, calm, like reading a number off a list. Then everything happened at once. 2 more came up onto the southern roof. She shifted, Toller said the rifle barely moved, just this tiny, economical drift, and the first of them dropped, and the second froze for half a second at the sight of his friend falling for no reason he could see, and that half second was the last mistake he ever made. 2, 3. Down in the courtyard, we were moving. I remember crossing that open dirt with my heart slamming and some animal part of my brain screaming that we were exposed. We were in the open. This was where men die. And rounds were cracking, but they weren't coming down on us. They weren't coming from the roofs. Because every time a shooter got up onto a roof to rain down on us, he was gone before he could pull the trigger. We didn't understand it in the moment. You don't, when you're inside it. You just feel this strange, impossible mercy, this open ground that should have been death and somehow wasn't. It was only afterward that we understood we'd been walking under an umbrella she was holding up over us one shot at a time. A fourth one made it to a roof, and actually got a burst off, wild, panicked into the dirt before she took him. 4. A fifth tried to use the parapet, just the top of his head and his weapon edging over the lip of the roof. A sliver of a target. Most shooters on Earth don't take that shot at that distance in the dark. She took it. 5. I heard later that around this point, back at the command post, the men listening to the radio had gone completely silent. Because the calls just kept coming, steady as a metronome in that flat, unbothered voice. 6. 7. Two of them tried something smarter. They didn't go for the roofs. They moved along the inner wall toward where the hostages were being kept, and you could feel the whole thing tip toward catastrophe. Because if they reached the hostages first, the math of the night changed completely. She couldn't see them behind the wall. But she'd read that valley for 3 weeks, and she'd read that compound through the scope for the last hour, and she knew there was a gap in the wall, a place where the mud brick had crumbled, and you could see a man-width slice of the inner courtyard if you knew exactly where to look. She put her crosshairs on that gap, the empty gap, and she waited. Toller said he didn't understand what she was doing. He whispered, "Ma'am, there's nothing," and she said very quietly, "Wait." And a man ran through the gap. 8. And a second behind him, and that one she caught mid-stride, in the slice of open she'd been holding on for no reason Toller could see. 9. By now the assault was deep inside. We'd reached the building where the hostages were. I was on the door when it opened, and I'll tell you, the look on those 4 faces, the 2 nurses, the logistics guy, the translator, I still see it. That look of people who had truly believed they were going to die, suddenly seeing men come through the door who were there for them. One of the nurses just sat down on the floor. Her legs went out from under her. The relief did it. But it wasn't over. Because the last of them, the most dangerous of them, the ones who didn't panic, had figured out the one thing left to figure out. They couldn't win the roofs. They couldn't win the courtyard. So they did the worst thing they could do. They tried to get to the hostages and turn them into shields, or worse. 3 of them broke toward the holding building from the far side, the side away from us fast, using the buildings for cover. We couldn't see them coming. We were inside getting the hostages up, focused on the door we'd come through. She saw them. 1,100 meters away, lying in the dirt, she saw 3 men moving toward the building full of her people from an angle none of us on the ground could cover. And she had maybe a few seconds. The first one she took in the open between 2 buildings. 10. The second made it almost to the wall of the building we were in. Toller said she had to shoot through the narrowest lane. A man running flat out, and the wind had shifted. That dusk wind she knew. And she'd already accounted for it before she even knew she'd accounted for it. 11. And the last one. The last one reached the corner of our building. He was close to us now, close to the hostages, close enough that the angle from the shelf was almost impossible. She was shooting at a sliver of him past the edge of a wall, at 1,100 meters in the dark, with 4 innocent people just on the other side of that same wall. 1 degree of error and the round goes into the building, into the room with the hostages, into us. Toller said the longest silence of the whole night was right before that shot. She held and held. He could hear his own pulse. And he said the only thing she said, so quiet he almost missed it, was to herself, not the radio, "Easy." The rifle spoke one more time. 12 clear. That was it. From the breach to that last call was about 5 minutes. I've heard people round it up and round it down over the years, but it was about 5 minutes. 12 hostiles, every one of them in the window between when they became a threat and when they could act on it. Not one round into that compound that wasn't exactly where she meant it to go. We got the 4 hostages out, all of them. They walked off that compound alive because of a person they never saw, who they will never be able to thank, lying in the dirt on a rock in the dark. I want to tell you about the part nobody puts in the story when they tell it loud. When we got back to base, gray light coming up over the ridge, exhausted in that hollowed-out way you get after the adrenaline drains, the whole tone of the unit had changed. You could feel it. Men who'd rolled their eyes at her a day before couldn't quite meet anybody's eye, because they'd heard it. They'd heard the count come in over the radio, that flat, steady voice, 12 times, while their own brothers walked across open ground and lived. Kavek came down off that ridge with Toller. She was filthy. Dust caked into the lines of her face. She'd been lying motionless in the cold for hours, and you could see what it had cost her in the way she moved, slow, stiff, wrung out. She didn't say anything triumphant. She didn't say anything at all. She just handed her weapon off to be cleaned and went to get coffee like it was any other morning. And Briggs walked up to her. Big loud Briggs, who'd laughed in that tent, and the whole room sort of held its breath because nobody knew what was coming. He stopped in front of her, and this enormous man who'd called her a school teacher, who'd said that wasn't a place to prove a point, he didn't have any words at first. His jaw was working, and finally he just said, "I owe you an apology, ma'am." And she gave him that long pause of hers, 1 second, 2. Then she said, "You don't owe me anything. Just don't ever question whether I'm watching your six again." And she walked off with her coffee. That was the whole thing. No speech. No told you so. She'd carried 11 men across a killing floor on her back, and she went and drank her coffee like it was nothing, because to her it wasn't a point that needed proving. It was just the job. It had always just been the job. The only people who needed convincing were us, and she'd never cared whether we were convinced. She'd cared whether those 4 aid workers got to go home. And they did. I think about her a lot. I think about all those evenings she spent out past the last container, lying in the dirt, reading a valley that the rest of us drove past without seeing. We thought she was showing off. She was loving us. That's what it was. She was learning the exact shape of the air so that, when the worst night came, she could hold an umbrella over men who'd mocked her, and never once let them know how close it had been. The men who laughed loudest were the ones she protected best, and she never said a word about it. People ask me what the worst part of that night was. I told you at the start it was knowing half the men wanted her to fail. But I'll tell you the part that stays with me the most all these years later. It's that she knew it too. She knew exactly what they thought of her, and it didn't change a single thing she did. She protected them anyway. That's the part I can't get past. That's the part I tell my own kids about when they're old enough to understand it. Not the 12, not the 5 minutes, not the impossible shots. It's that the people who deserved it least got the best of her, and she gave it to them without being asked, and walked away to drink her coffee. The loudest man in the room is rarely the most dangerous one. The most dangerous one is usually the quiet woman in the corner, eating cold beans, deciding whether you're worth the words, and already 3 weeks into learning the exact wind that will one day save your life.